The cruelest thing Ethan Whitmore ever did was not throwing his wife out into the rain. It was believing she deserved it. At 11:47 on a cold Thursday night, the front doors of the Whitmore estate opened, and Claire Whitmore's suitcase hit the stone steps with a dull, final sound. Rain fell hard over the long driveway, turning the marble entrance slick and silver beneath the porch lights. Claire stood there in a simple white coat, her dark blonde hair damp against her cheeks, her hands empty, her face calm in a way that made Ethan angrier than tears ever could. Behind him, his mother, Margaret Whitmore, stood with her arms folded, wearing the satisfied expression of a woman who had finally won. His younger sister, Madison, leaned near the staircase. Watching like this was the ending she had been waiting for. Ethan held up a folder filled with printed messages, bank statements, and lies arranged neatly enough to look like truth. His voice was low, but every word landed like a door closing. You used my family, Claire. You used my father's sickness, my company, and me. Claire looked at the folder, then at the man she had married 3 years earlier, the man who once promised he would never let anyone make her feel alone. For 1 second, something broke behind her eyes. But she did not beg. She did not explain. She did not tell him about the hospital call she answered at 2 a.m., or the specialist she had flown in from Boston, or the private loan she had signed to keep Whitmore Holdings from collapsing before Christmas. She only reached for the wedding ring on her finger. Ethan's jaw tightened. Don't make this dramatic, he said. Claire slipped the ring off slowly and placed it in his palm. Her voice was soft, almost lost beneath the rain. One day, Ethan, you will know who really saved this family. Margaret gave a sharp laugh from behind him. Saved us. Please. Claire picked up her suitcase. She walked down the steps, past the rose bushes she had planted for Richard Whitmore because he loved the smell after rain, past the windows where she had spent years being treated like a guest in her own marriage. Ethan slammed the door before she reached the driveway. 10 seconds later, his phone rang. He almost ignored it. Then he saw the caller ID. St. Mary's Hospital. When he answered, the doctor's voice was tense. Mr. Whitmore, your father's condition has changed. The surgery is moving forward tonight. Ethan froze. That's impossible. The hospital said we didn't have approval. There was a pause. Then the doctor said, we received the guarantee this evening. From your wife. For 3 years, Claire Whitmore had lived inside a house where every hallway reminded her that love did not always protect a person from loneliness. The Whitmore estate sat on 12 acres outside Greenwich, Connecticut, with white columns, polished floors, and windows so tall they made every room feel like a showroom instead of a home. From the outside, Claire looked like the lucky one, the ordinary woman who had married into an old American family with a private gate, a lake behind the property, and portraits of ancestors who had never needed to explain themselves to anyone. But inside those walls, she had learned how quietly a person could disappear. In the beginning, Ethan had been different. He had met her at a charity dinner in Boston, where she was helping coordinate patient support for families who could not afford long hospital stays. He had not cared that her dress was simple or that she drove a 10-year-old sedan with a dent near the passenger door. He had told her she had the rare kind of calm that made chaos feel smaller. He had listened when she spoke. He had laughed easily. He had looked at her like she was not a stranger standing outside his world, but the missing part of it. That was the Ethan she married. But that Ethan slowly faded under the weight of his family name. Margaret Whitmore never shouted at Claire. That would have been too easy to call cruelty. Margaret preferred small cuts with a pleasant smile. At Sunday dinners, she would ask Claire whether she understood which fork to use, then laugh softly as if it were a harmless joke. When guests visited, she introduced Claire as Ethan's wife, but always added that Claire came from a very modest background, as though humility were a stain on the furniture. Madison, Ethan's younger sister, was sharper. She called Claire sweet in public and useless in private. She said Claire had married upward so fast that she must have gotten dizzy. Ethan heard some of it. Claire knew he heard it. At first, he would touch her hand beneath the table and whisper that his mother needed time. Then his whispers became silence. Then silence became agreement. By the second year, Claire had stopped asking Ethan to defend her because every conversation ended the same way, with him rubbing his forehead and saying, "Please do not make things harder right now." Harder. That word followed her through the house, like a shadow. It became harder when Richard Whitmore, Ethan's father, collapsed during a board meeting in Manhattan, and came home with a diagnosis the family did not want discussed outside a locked room. Richard had always been formal with Claire, but never unkind. He was the only Whitmore who looked her in the eye when she spoke. After his illness, the house changed. Nurses came and went. Phone calls happened behind closed doors. Ethan spent longer hours at Whitmore Holdings, trying to keep investors calm, while Margaret worried more about reputation than recovery. Madison complained that the house felt depressing. Claire was the one who learned Richard's medication schedule. Claire was the one who sat beside him when he could not sleep. Claire was the one who drove 42 miles round trip to pick up a prescription when the regular pharmacy made a mistake. Richard noticed. One evening, while rain tapped softly against the windows of his private sitting room, he looked at Claire and said, "You are the only person in this house who does not treat me like a problem to manage." Claire smiled and adjusted the blanket over his knees. "That is because you are not a problem. You are family." He held her gaze for a long moment, and something like guilt moved across his face. Then he said, "Ethan does not know what he has." Claire looked away because she still hoped someday he would. What no one knew was that Claire's life had already split into two separate worlds. During the day, she moved quietly through the Whitmore estate, absorbing Margaret's polite insults, Madison's suspicious looks, and Ethan's growing distance. But at night, after the house settled and the long driveway went black beyond the windows, Claire sat at the desk in the small guest room she had started using as an office and made calls that would have shocked every person who underestimated her. She contacted specialists in Boston, Chicago, and Baltimore. She sent medical records through secure hospital portals. She waited on hold for insurance administrators who treated urgency like paperwork. She learned the language of Richard's condition well enough to challenge decisions that made no sense. When one hospital committee delayed approval, Claire found another surgeon with a stronger track record. When a treatment required a guarantee the Whitmore family accounts could not provide without exposing the company's financial trouble, Claire made a choice no one in that house would have believed. She sold the small Cape Cod cottage her late mother had left her, the only place that still smelled like her childhood, salt air, and lavender soap. The cottage was worth less than one Whitmore antique chandelier, but to Claire it had been everything. She signed the papers in a lawyer's office on a gray Tuesday morning, sitting alone beneath fluorescent lights while Ethan was across town accusing her of not understanding family pressure. She did not tell him. She had promised Richard that his illness would not become public before the board secured the emergency financing. If investors learned how fragile both the founder and the company were, Whitmore Holdings could collapse in days. Thousands of employees depended on that company. Ethan's father depended on that surgery. And Ethan, even when he stopped trusting her, still depended on the family name he was trying so desperately to save. So Claire stayed quiet. She wired the first payment to the hospital foundation under a private arrangement. She negotiated with a creditor who had been ready to move against Whitmore Holdings before the holidays. She found a buyer willing to keep a major contract alive, but only because Claire convinced him that the company still had a future beyond Whitmore Pride. That buyer never knew she was the wife no one listened to at dinner. He knew her as the only person in the room who came prepared. Some nights, she slept less than 3 hours. Some mornings Margaret would look at the shadows beneath her eyes and say, "Claire, dear, you always look so tired. Perhaps charity work is too much for you." Claire would smile, pour Richard his tea, and say nothing. The cruelest part was not that they misunderstood her. It was that she had become useful to them in ways they were too arrogant to see. She carried their secrets, protected their reputation, cared for their father, and shielded their company, all while being treated like a temporary mistake Ethan had not yet corrected. Richard tried twice to tell Ethan the truth. The first time, his breathing became strained before he could finish. The second time, Margaret entered the room and interrupted with a warning look Claire did not miss. Later that evening, Richard asked Claire to bring him the leather folder from his study. His hands trembled as he placed several documents inside, including copies of the hospital guarantee, the sale record of Claire's cottage, and a letter written in his careful, old-fashioned handwriting. On the front, he wrote 5 words. "For Ethan, when he is ready." Claire stood beside him, her throat tight. "He should know now," she said quietly. Richard shook his head. "Not while the company is this weak. Not while Margaret is this afraid. If I do not make it through surgery, that folder will tell him everything." Claire wanted to argue, but Richard looked so tired that she could not add another burden to his chest. So she agreed to keep one more secret. That secret became the rope Margaret used against her. As the company pressure grew, Margaret began watching Claire more closely. Madison started asking why Claire received so many private calls. Ethan came home one night and found Claire closing her laptop after a hospital email. He asked what she was hiding. Claire told him it was about his father and that he needed to trust her for just a little longer. For the first time, Ethan looked at her not with confusion, but with suspicion. "Trust you," he said, as though the word had turned sour. "After everything my mother has noticed? After the missing money, the strange calls, the way my father keeps asking for you instead of us?" Claire felt the room tilt. Missing money? Ethan did not answer. He only stared at her like a man searching for proof that his wife was exactly what his family had warned him she would become. In that moment, Claire understood that Margaret had not been merely insulting her for 3 years. She had been waiting for the perfect moment to remove her. And now, with Richard too weak to speak clearly, the company too unstable for public truth, and Ethan too exhausted to think for himself, that moment had arrived. Claire could have opened every file. She could have shown him every receipt, every email, every signed document proving that she had given more to the Whitmore family than anyone knew. But doing so would expose Richard's surgery plan before the final approval cleared. It would reveal the company's hidden financial crisis. It might save her marriage and destroy everything she had sacrificed to protect. So she swallowed the truth. She looked at Ethan, the man who had once promised that her heart would always be safe with him, and realized he no longer knew the difference between loyalty and lies. That was why, when he threw her suitcase onto the steps days later, Claire did not fight. She already knew the battle had been lost long before the door opened. It had been lost in every dinner where he stayed silent, every accusation he allowed to grow, every moment he chose the comfort of believing his family over the courage of believing his wife. But as Claire walked into the rain, the truth she had protected did not stay buried behind her. It was already moving through hospital wires, legal signatures, and one sealed folder waiting in Richard Whitmore's study, ready to turn Ethan's entire world inside out. The lie that destroyed Claire's marriage did not arrive all at once. It was built carefully, piece by piece, in quiet rooms where Margaret Whitmore spoke softly enough to sound reasonable and Madison smiled brightly enough to look innocent. By the time Ethan believed it, the lie already had documents, dates, messages, and witnesses arranged around it like furniture in a house Claire had never entered. 3 nights before he threw her out, Ethan came home after midnight from the Whitmore Holdings office in Manhattan, his tie loosened, his face pale from another emergency board call. The company was bleeding trust. A major lender had asked for additional guarantees. 2 investors were threatening to pull back. Richard's surgery approval still had not been officially announced to the family, and Ethan had spent the whole day pretending he was in control while every number in front of him said otherwise. When he walked into the estate, Margaret was waiting in the library with the fireplace on and a glass of water untouched beside her. Madison sat near the window with red eyes, as if she had been crying just long enough for him to notice. Ethan stopped in the doorway. "What happened?" Margaret looked down at a folder in her lap, then up at him with practiced hesitation. "I did not want to show you this tonight. You are exhausted." Madison wiped beneath one eye. "He needs to know, Mom." Ethan stepped forward, already bracing himself for bad news from the bank or another doctor's call. But Margaret did not mention the company. She opened the folder and slid several printed pages across the coffee table. Bank activity, screenshots, a list of transfers from an account connected to family household expenses. At first, Ethan did not understand what he was seeing. Then Margaret placed her finger beside a name that appeared again and again near the timing of the withdrawals. "Claire." Ethan stared at the page. "This does not make sense." Margaret's voice trembled in exactly the right place. "I hoped it was a misunderstanding. I truly did. But when I asked her about the private calls, she became defensive. When I asked why your father kept requesting her, she changed the subject." Madison leaned forward. "And that is not all." She pulled out her phone and showed Ethan a string of messages from an unknown number, saved under no name. The messages were vague enough to suggest intimacy and specific enough to feel damning. "I miss the way things were. He does not suspect anything. Once the money clears, you can finally leave." Ethan read the screen once, then again, his stomach tightening. Who sent these? Madison looked away. I saw them pop up on Claire's laptop when she left it open in the breakfast room. I did not want to invade her privacy, but then I saw your name, and I got scared. Ethan took the phone from her hand. The messages looked real. The timestamps matched evenings when Claire had been in the guest room office with the door closed. The unknown number had a Boston area code, the same city Claire claimed she was contacting for Richard's care. His mind tried to defend her for one last second. Claire would not do this. Margaret looked at him with sad patience, the kind a mother uses when telling a child something painful but necessary. Ethan, love does not make a person honest. Madison whispered, she has been playing all of us. The cruel genius of the accusation was that it used Claire's sacrifices as evidence against her. Every late-night hospital call became secrecy. Every financial document became theft. Every private meeting became betrayal. Every time Richard asked for her instead of his own family became manipulation. Ethan did not see the trap because he was already standing inside it. The next morning, Claire noticed the change immediately. Ethan did not kiss her cheek before leaving. He did not ask whether Richard had slept through the night. He stood near the kitchen island, watching her pour coffee as if the movement of her hands might confess something. Is there anything you need to tell me? He asked. Claire turned toward him, holding the warm mug between both palms. About what? About the accounts. The private calls. Boston. She went still. Her first instinct was relief because she thought he had discovered the surgery guarantee in the specialist team. Then she saw his eyes. They were not worried. They were accusing. Claire set the mug down slowly. Ethan, some of this is about your father, and I need you to trust me until the hospital finishes the approval process. His expression hardened. That answer might have worked last month. It will not work now. Claire felt something cold move through her chest. What did your mother tell you? Do not do that, Ethan said, his voice rising just enough to cut. Do not turn this into my mother being cruel to you. This is about you. Your calls. Your lies. Your access to money that does not belong to you. She looked at him, stunned by the distance in his face. Money that does not belong to me. Ethan, I have never taken a dollar from this family. He gave a humorless laugh. Then explain the transfers. Explain the messages. Explain why every time I ask a simple question, you hide behind my father's illness. Claire's hand moved toward the folder on the desk near the window, the folder that contained enough truth to end the argument in seconds. But inside that folder were the hospital documents Richard had begged her to protect until the surgery was secured. If Ethan, in his anger, brought those papers to Margaret or the board, Richard's private medical situation could spread through the company before dawn. The lender could panic. The investors could walk. The contract Claire had fought to save could vanish. One explanation could protect her reputation and destroy the fragile bridge, keeping the Whitmore family from falling. She pulled her hand back. Ethan saw the movement and misunderstood it. You were reaching for something. What is in that folder? Claire stepped in front of the desk. Not because it was proof against her, but because it was proof of what she had done for them. And that made him angrier. He walked toward her. Let me see it. I cannot. His face changed. That was the moment he stopped asking and started deciding. Madison entered then, as if she had been waiting close enough to hear her cue. She carried another page in her hand, folded once. I am sorry, Ethan. I found this in the printer tray. Claire looked at the paper, and her breath caught. It was a copy of a wire confirmation, but the heading had been altered. The original showed Claire's personal funds being transferred toward Richard's medical guarantee. This version made it look like money had moved out of a Whitmore household account into an outside holding account connected to Claire. The numbers were familiar. The meaning had been twisted. Claire stared at Madison. Where did you get this? Madison's eyes widened with perfect innocence. From the printer. Claire, please do not act like I made it. Margaret appeared behind her daughter, calm and composed in a cream sweater, her silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. No one wants to believe this, Claire. But you have made it very difficult for us not to. Claire turned to Ethan. Listen to me. That document is not what it looks like. Then show me what it is, Ethan said. Tell me everything right now. Claire closed her eyes for half a second. She thought of Richard in the upstairs room, sleeping under a gray blanket, his breathing monitor glowing blue beside the bed. She thought of the surgeon's assistant telling her approval was within reach, but confidentiality had to be maintained until signatures cleared. She thought of the employees whose paychecks depended on a company that was already shaking beneath their feet. Then she thought of the cottage in Cape Cod. Gone now. Its key no longer hers. Sold so Ethan's father could have a chance to live. When she opened her eyes, Ethan was waiting. So were Margaret and Madison. All three of them wanted an answer. But only one of them deserved the truth, and he had just proven he would rather trust a beautiful lie than an ugly sacrifice. I cannot tell you tonight, Claire said. Ethan's face emptied. Margaret exhaled like a woman who had been proven right against her will. Madison looked down to hide the satisfaction in her eyes. That evening, the house became a courtroom without a judge. Margaret called the family attorney, not to file charges, she said, but to protect the estate. Madison told Ethan she had seen Claire speaking in the driveway with a man in a dark sedan 2 weeks earlier, leaving out the fact that the man was the hospital financial coordinator delivering documents Richard could not sign in public. Ethan asked Claire about it in the upstairs hall, his voice low and tight. She told him it was connected to Richard's care. Again, he asked for details. Again, she refused. Every refusal looked like guilt. Every silence gave Margaret more power. By the next day, Ethan had moved into the master suite alone, and Claire slept in the guest room office beside stacks of papers she no longer knew how to protect. Richard sensed the shift before anyone told him. When Claire brought his medication, he held her wrist gently and asked, "What has she done?" Claire tried to smile. "You need to rest." His eyes sharpened despite his weakness. "Margaret, what has she done?" Claire did not answer. Richard turned his face toward the locked drawer where the leather folder waited. "Give that to Ethan." "Not yet," Claire whispered. "The surgery is not fully cleared. If the company finds out before the financing closes, everything you built could fall apart." Richard's voice was faint. "Let it fall before I let them bury you with lies." But Claire shook her head. "You trusted me to protect your family. I will, even if they do not deserve it?" he asked. Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. Even then, that night, the final piece arrived. Ethan received an anonymous email with an attached photograph of Claire entering a downtown hotel lobby with the same hospital coordinator Madison had described. The photo was real. The story attached to it was not. Claire had met him there because the hospital foundation was hosting a private donor meeting in a conference room and using the Whitmore estate. Her company office would have exposed Richard's condition. But the image showed only what Margaret needed it to show, Claire beside another man, under warm hotel lights, with a folder in her hand and secrecy in the air. Ethan printed the photograph and placed it on the dining room table in front of her after dinner. Richard had been taken upstairs early. Margaret sat at one end of the table. Madison sat at the other. Claire looked at the picture, then at Ethan, and saw that he was no longer asking for truth. He was asking her to admit the version he had already chosen. "Who is he?" Ethan asked. Claire swallowed. "Someone helping your father." Ethan's hand curled against the table. "Stop using my father. I am not using him." "Then tell me his name." She could not. The coordinator had signed a confidentiality agreement connected to the guarantee, the financing, and the surgical approval. Naming him in front of Margaret would reveal too much. Claire understood then that the lie had been designed perfectly. It did not need to prove she had betrayed Ethan. It only needed to force her into silence until her silence looked like betrayal. Ethan stood. "I want you out of this house until I decide what happens next." Margaret did not move, but her victory filled the room. Madison looked down at her plate, smiling just enough for Claire to see. Claire rose slowly. For one wild second, she almost told him everything. She almost said she had sold her mother's cottage. She almost said his father's surgery existed because of her. She almost said the company he was killing himself to save had survived the last month because the wife he doubted had negotiated in rooms where his name alone no longer opened doors. But before she could speak, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from St. Mary's Hospital appeared on the screen. Final approval received. Surgical team on standby. Guarantee accepted. Claire looked at the message, and all the anger drained out of her, replaced by something heavier. The surgery was finally moving forward. Richard had a chance. The family she was losing might still be saved. She turned the phone face down before anyone could read it. Ethan saw that too. "Another secret?" he asked. Claire looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "The only truth that matters tonight." He misunderstood her completely. By morning, Margaret had packed Claire's suitcase herself and placed it near the front doors, as if removing a stain from the house. Ethan spent the day at the office, refusing her calls. Madison sent one final message from the fake number to Claire's laptop, then made sure Ethan saw the notification when he came home. At 11:47 that night, with rain striking the windows and Richard sleeping under hospital instructions upstairs, Ethan opened the front door and threw Claire's suitcase onto the stone steps. He thought he was cutting betrayal out of his life. He had no idea he was sending away the only person still holding his family together. The moment Claire disappeared down the rain-dark driveway, the Whitmore estate became louder than it had ever been. Not with voices, not at first, but with the strange hollow sound of a house that had lost the one person who quietly kept it alive. Ethan stood in the foyer with Claire's wedding ring closed inside his fist, still holding the phone to his ear as the doctor from St. Mary's Hospital waited for him to respond. The words had entered his mind, but they had not settled there. "We received the guarantee this evening. From your wife." Ethan looked toward the door he had just slammed, then toward his mother, who had gone very still. Margaret's smile was gone. Madison had taken one step down from the staircase, her face pale under the chandelier light. Ethan forced himself to speak. "Doctor, there must be a mistake. My wife does not have authority over my father's medical care." The doctor's voice stayed professional, but there was something sharp beneath it. "Mr. Whitmore, your wife has been the primary private contact on several parts of your father's treatment coordination for weeks. She arranged the specialist review, secured the donor side clearance, and signed the financial guarantee that allowed us to move tonight." Ethan turned slowly toward Margaret. His mother shook her head before he asked anything, but her eyes had already betrayed the first crack. "That is impossible," she whispered. Madison quickly said, "He is confused. Hospitals make mistakes all the time." Ethan wanted to believe that. He needed to believe it because the alternative meant the woman he had just thrown into the storm had been telling the truth in the only way she could. The doctor continued, "Your father is being transferred into preoperative care. We need a family decision maker present within the hour. Your wife listed you as the emergency contact, but she also left a note asking that Richard Whitmore be told the surgery was approved only after he was stabilized." Ethan could not breathe for a second. "She left a note?" "Yes, sir." The doctor paused. She seemed very concerned that stress would affect him. Ethan lowered the phone. The foyer seemed to tilt under his feet. Margaret stepped closer and reached for his arm. "Ethan, listen to me. Whatever Claire signed, whatever she told them, she may have done it to make herself look necessary. You know how these people operate. These people." The phrase struck him differently now. For 3 years, Margaret had placed Claire outside the family with words like that. People like her. Women like her. These people. Ethan had heard it so often that he had stopped hearing the cruelty inside it. But before he could answer, the hospital called again, this time through the house line. Margaret jumped at the sound. Madison said she would get it, but Ethan raised his hand. "No, I will." The second call was from a nurse asking whether Claire Whitmore was on her way with Richard's medication history binder, because the electronic chart referenced notes Claire had personally maintained after discovering 2 dosage errors in previous records. Ethan looked across the foyer at the small table where Claire used to leave Richard's tea tray. The binder was not there. Of course it was not there. Claire had carried it every evening, updated it every night, and no one had thought to ask where she kept it because no one had believed her work mattered. Within 20 minutes, the estate was in chaos. Richard woke upstairs confused and asking for Claire. He refused to leave for the hospital until someone told him where she was. Margaret tried to soothe him, but he turned his face away. Madison could not find the binder. The night nurse did not know the full medication list because Claire had been the one communicating changes between doctors. Ethan searched the guest room office and found the desk drawers empty except for a single sticky note in Claire's handwriting. "Richard's blue folder is in the lower cabinet. Hospital number is taped inside. Please make sure he gets the gray bottle only after food." No anger. No accusation. Even after what he had done, she had left instructions to protect his father. That hurt more than any defense she could have given. At the hospital, the damage grew clearer. The surgeon from Boston recognized Ethan's name, but asked immediately where Claire was. Ethan said she was unavailable. The surgeon's expression changed. "Mrs. Whitmore has been handling the critical coordination. She is the reason I reviewed this case personally." Margaret, standing beside Ethan in the private waiting area, gave a tight smile. "I am Richard's wife. Surely you can speak with me." The surgeon nodded politely. Of course. But Mrs. Whitmore has the most complete timeline of his recent treatment. Margaret had no answer. Madison stared at her phone. Ethan stared at the vending machines across the hall, remembering all the nights Claire had said she was tired and he had assumed she was avoiding him. By sunrise, Richard was in surgery, and the Whitmore family sat in a waiting room that felt too bright and too cold. Ethan had not slept. Claire had not answered any of his calls. Each attempt went straight to voicemail. At 6:13 in the morning, the first business disaster arrived. A message from Daniel Mercer, the lender who had been threatening Whitmore Holdings, appeared on Ethan's phone. We need to discuss the December bridge arrangement. Claire Whitmore was the only reason I delayed action. If she is no longer involved, my position changes. Ethan read it 3 times. Claire was involved with Mercer? He called immediately. Daniel answered with the dry patience of a man who had expected the call. Ethan, I do not know what happened in your house, and frankly, I do not care. But your wife negotiated the most reasonable repayment path anyone from your company has offered in 6 months. She understood the numbers better than half your board. Ethan's grip tightened around the phone. My wife had no official role. Daniel gave a short laugh. Then perhaps she should have. Because without her, I am not comfortable waiting. 2 hours later, another call came from a West Coast distributor Ethan had been trying to keep from walking away. The man said the same thing in a different way. Claire had been the one who convinced them Whitmore Holdings could recover. Claire had sent the revised proposal. Claire had remembered that the distributor's daughter needed a pediatric specialist and connected the family to a nonprofit contact in Boston. Claire had not sold them a contract. She had built trust. By noon, Ethan had a legal pad full of names, dates, and conversations he had never known existed. Every line led back to the wife he had accused of taking from his family. Every call revealed another way she had been giving. Margaret tried to interrupt the pattern before it became undeniable. She told Ethan that Claire was manipulative, that clever women often made themselves indispensable before asking for something. That generosity could be a mask. But her voice no longer worked on him the same way. Something in him had shifted in that hospital hallway when Richard, still under medication but awake enough to recognize his son, had whispered one name. Claire. Not Margaret. Not Madison. Not even Ethan. Claire. And when Ethan told him she was not there, Richard's eyes filled with a disappointment so deep Ethan had to look away. The surgery was successful, but Richard's recovery was fragile. The doctor told them the next 48 hours mattered. Claire still did not answer. Ethan sent a text, then another, then erased a third because every sentence sounded too small. Where are you? Please call me. Dad is asking for you. Finally, near evening, a reply arrived from Claire's phone, but it was not from Claire. It was from an attorney named Rebecca Hale. Mr. Whitmore, please direct all further communication regarding Mrs. Whitmore through this office. Temporary separation documentation will be forwarded tomorrow morning. Ethan stood outside Richard's hospital room reading the message until the screen dimmed. Separation documentation. The words felt colder than the rain had looked on her coat. He walked back into the waiting area and found Margaret speaking quietly to Madison near the windows. They stopped when they saw him. That silence told him more than their excuses had. Ethan looked at his sister first. Who sent the messages? Madison blinked. What? The messages you showed me. The ones on Claire's laptop. Who sent them? Margaret stepped forward. Ethan, this is not the time. He did not look at her. Madison. His sister's mouth opened, but no answer came. For the first time, Ethan noticed how young her lies looked without confidence wrapped around them. Then his phone buzzed again. This time it was the family attorney, sounding nervous. Ethan, I have reviewed the documents your mother gave me, and there are inconsistencies. Serious ones. The wire confirmation appears altered. I also received a call from Richard's private counsel asking whether you had opened the folder in his study. Ethan went completely still. What folder? There was a pause on the line. He said it is marked for you, when you are ready. Ethan turned toward the hospital windows, where the city lights blurred against the glass. Somewhere beyond those lights, Claire was gone from the house, gone from his calls, already placing distance between herself and the family she had saved. Behind him, Margaret said his name, but he barely heard her, because suddenly he remembered the lower drawer in his father's study. The locked one Claire had stood in front of, the one he had mistaken for proof of guilt. And for the first time since the rain began, Ethan understood that the truth had never been hidden from him. He had simply been too blind, too proud, and too afraid to open it. Ethan drove back to the Whitmore estate before sunrise, while the streets of Greenwich were still empty and the sky above the trees was the color of cold steel. He had left Margaret and Madison at the hospital with strict instructions to stay away from Richard's room unless a nurse called them in. For the first time in his life, his mother had looked at him as if she did not know how to control him, and for the first time, Ethan had not cared. The house looked different when he pulled through the gate. The same white columns stood beneath the same porch lights. The same long windows reflected the same pale morning. But something about the estate felt exposed now, like a beautiful place after the music stops and the dust becomes visible. He stepped into the foyer where Claire's suitcase had struck the stone less than 2 days earlier. The spot had already been cleaned. Margaret had probably asked someone to make sure there was no trace of that night. But Ethan could still see it. The white coat, soaked with rain. The ring in his palm. Claire's voice saying that one day he would know who really saved this family. He had laughed at those words. That memory stayed with him as he walked toward Richard's study. The room smelled faintly of leather, old paper, and the cedarwood cologne his father had worn for decades. Ethan had always found comfort there as a boy. It was where Richard had taught him how to shake hands properly, how to read a balance sheet, how to lose with dignity and win without making smaller people feel smaller. But standing there now, Ethan wondered when he had stopped learning from his father and started listening only to fear. The lower drawer of the walnut desk was locked. Ethan searched the top drawer for a key and found nothing. He checked the bookshelf, the small brass tray near the lamp, the cigar box Richard never used anymore. Nothing. Then he remembered Claire. She always knew where Richard kept things because she had been the one caring for him, while everyone else pretended that concern was the same as service. Ethan walked to the cabinet where she had left the medication note and opened the lower door. Taped to the inside was a small envelope with his name written in Richard's hand. Ethan. His pulse changed. Inside was a key and a note with only one sentence. If you are opening this without Claire beside you, then you have already failed her. Ethan stood motionless for a long time. The house was silent around him, but those words filled the room like a verdict. He returned to the desk, unlocked the drawer, and found a dark leather folder lying flat inside. On the front, written in the same careful handwriting, were the words the attorney had repeated over the phone. For Ethan, when he is ready. Ethan sat in his father's chair before opening it because something in him already knew he would not be the same man after reading what was inside. The first document was the hospital guarantee. Claire's full legal name appeared on the signature line. Claire Elizabeth Whitmore. Beneath it was a figure large enough to make Ethan stop breathing. She had guaranteed the surgical team, the specialized review, the private transfer, the emergency operating costs, and the post-treatment care plan. Not with Whitmore money. With personal collateral. Attached behind it was the sale record for a cottage in Chatham, Massachusetts. Ethan knew that address. Claire had mentioned it only twice in their marriage. It was the cottage her mother had left her, the place where Claire used to spend summers before her mother passed away, the one piece of family history she owned outright. Ethan remembered telling her they would visit someday. They never had. He had always been too busy. Now the deed transfer sat in his hands. Proof that she had sold the only home that was truly hers to save the father of a man who had thrown her out. Ethan pressed the paper flat on the desk, but his fingers would not stop trembling. The next pages came from Whitmore Holdings. Private correspondence. Revised debt terms. A bridge arrangement with Daniel Mercer. Notes from a late-night negotiation Claire had attended on behalf of Richard, though not officially under the company name. Ethan read the timeline slowly, each date landing in his chest. October 12th, Claire contacted Mercer to prevent accelerated repayment. October 19th, Claire provided a restructuring proposal after discovering an accounting error Ethan's finance team had missed. November 2nd, Claire secured an extension tied to a family-backed guarantee Richard had authorized privately. November 17th, Claire convinced the West Coast distributor to maintain the contract through the end of the quarter. Ethan saw his own name in one email, written by Daniel Mercer to Richard. Your son is under pressure and may not be seeing the whole board clearly. Claire is. If she is the one speaking for the family, I am willing to keep the door open. Ethan leaned back as if the chair had dropped beneath him. He had been drowning at the office, furious that Claire did not understand his burden, while she had been holding part of that burden without asking for credit. He had come home exhausted and suspicious, and she had been exhausted too, but for reasons he never bothered to see. The folder kept going. There were printed emails between Claire and a surgeon in Boston. A letter from a hospital foundation thanking her for moving quickly when delays could have changed Richard's outcome. A handwritten medication chart corrected in Claire's neat script after she noticed a dosage conflict. A note from Richard's private physician stating that Claire's attention to detail had likely prevented a serious setback during the waiting period. Ethan covered his mouth with one hand. He remembered every time Margaret had mocked Claire for looking tired. Every time Madison called her dramatic. Every time. He had walked past the guest room office and seen light beneath the door, assuming she was hiding something from him. She had been hiding something. His family's survival. Then he found Richard's letter. It was folded separately, written on thick cream paper, sealed once and opened again, as if Richard had reread it before placing it in the folder. Ethan unfolded it carefully. My son, if you are reading this, then I pray it is not too late for you to become the man I tried to raise. Claire did not take from this family. She gave more than any of us deserved. She sold what her mother left her so I could have a chance at surgery. She protected the company when your pride would not let you see its weakness. She absorbed your mother's suspicions and your sister's cruelty because I asked her to keep my condition private until the financing stabilized. That request was mine. The burden became hers. If you have hurt her because of the lies around you, do not ask first how to win her back. Ask whether you are worthy to stand in front of her at all. Ethan's vision blurred, but he kept reading. Your mother is afraid of losing control. Madison is afraid of losing comfort. You, Ethan, are afraid of being wrong. That fear will cost you the best person in your life if it has not already. Claire is family, whether this house had the wisdom to honor her or not. Protect her now, or spend the rest of your life knowing she protected us when we failed to protect her. By the time Ethan finished, the sun had risen enough to push a thin line of light across the study floor. He sat there with the letter in his lap, feeling shame move through him slowly, not as a sudden emotion, but as a complete rebuilding of the truth. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not one bad night. He had failed Claire over and over in small, ordinary ways until the final cruelty became possible. The folder held one more section, thinner than the rest. At first, Ethan thought it was another medical record. Then he saw Madison's name. Attached were printed screenshots from Richard's home security system. Not footage, just still images and time logs from the hallway outside the guest room office. Madison, entering when Claire was away. Madison leaving with Claire's laptop bag. Margaret standing near the door 30 minutes later. A note from Richard's private investigator explained that Richard had grown concerned about missing documents and had asked for quiet verification. Ethan's jaw tightened. There were also forensic notes from a technology consultant showing that the messages displayed on Claire's laptop had been sent from a prepaid number activated near a shopping center Madison visited weekly. The so-called altered wire document had been printed from Margaret's personal office printer at 4:42 in the afternoon, then reprinted from the family printer later to make it seem discovered. Every lie had a trail. Every accusation had a source. Ethan placed the pages on the desk one by one until the surface was covered with the architecture of his family's betrayal. The woman accused of deception had left evidence clean enough to save everyone but herself. The people demanding loyalty had manufactured proof because they knew Ethan was tired enough, proud enough, and weak enough to believe them. His phone rang. Margaret. He let it ring until it stopped. Then Madison called. He ignored that too. A minute later, a message appeared from his mother. Your father is asking for you. Please do not do anything emotional. Ethan almost laughed because that was what Margaret called accountability when it threatened her. Emotional. He gathered the folder, Richard's letter, the hospital records, the financial documents, and the evidence against Madison. Before leaving the study, he looked at the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Richard seated in the center. Margaret beside him. Madison in a pale blue dress. Ethan standing behind them in a navy suit. Claire at the edge, smiling softly, as if she already knew she had been placed where she could be cropped out. Ethan stared at that image until anger rose beneath the shame, but the anger was not for Claire. It was for himself. He had allowed the people in that portrait to teach him where his wife belonged. At the edge, in the background, useful but unheard, loved only when convenient. He drove back to the hospital with the folder on the passenger seat. The ring was still in his coat pocket, heavier than it had ever felt on Claire's hand. When he reached Richard's room, his father was awake, pale but alert, with an oxygen tube beneath his nose and disappointment already waiting in his eyes. Ethan closed the door behind him. Margaret and Madison stood near the window, both turning at once when they saw the folder. Margaret's face changed first. Not fear exactly. Calculation. Ethan placed the folder on the small table beside Richard's bed. "Dad," he said quietly, "I opened it." Richard closed his eyes, and one tear slipped down toward his temple. Not because he was surprised, Ethan realized, but because he had hoped this day would not come without Claire in the room. Margaret stepped forward. "Richard, you should be resting." "Ethan, this is not appropriate." Ethan looked at her. "Did you alter the wire confirmation?" The room went silent. Madison's lips parted. Margaret lifted her chin. "I did what was necessary to protect this family." "From Claire?" Ethan asked. "From a woman who sold her mother's house to save your husband? From a woman who kept your company alive while you smiled at dinner and called her ungrateful?" Margaret's face hardened. "She was never one of us." Richard's voice, weak but clear, cut through the room. "She was more one of us than you have been in years." Margaret turned toward him, stunned. Madison began to cry, but Ethan could no longer tell whether the tears were fear, guilt, or another performance. He looked at his sister. "The messages came from your number arrangement. The laptop. The hotel photograph. You helped make all of it look like betrayal." Madison shook her head quickly. "Mom said Claire was going to take everything. She said if we did not stop her, she would control Dad, the company, all of it." Ethan stared at her, hearing how small the lies sounded now that daylight had touched it. Claire had not wanted control. She had wanted Richard alive. She had wanted Ethan safe from a collapse he had been too proud to admit was coming. She had wanted a family that never made room for her. Richard turned his head toward Ethan. "Where is she?" Ethan had no answer. For all the documents, all the proof, all the terrible clarity, he still did not know where his wife had gone after walking down that driveway in the rain. His silence told Richard everything. The older man closed his eyes again. "Find her," he whispered. "Not to bring her back. To tell her we know." That distinction struck Ethan harder than any accusation. Not to bring her back. To tell her we know. Because Claire's return was no longer something he had the right to expect. It was something he would have to become worthy even to ask for. Ethan stepped out into the hallway and called Rebecca Hale, Claire's attorney. When she answered, her voice was calm and guarded. "Mr. Whitmore, I assume this is urgent." Ethan looked through the glass wall at his family, at his mother's rigid posture, his sister's shaking hands, his father's tired face. "It is," he said. "I know the truth now." There was a pause. Then Rebecca said, "That does not change what happened." Ethan closed his eyes. "I know. I need to speak with Claire." Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Whitmore asked me to tell you only one thing if you called after opening the folder." Ethan gripped the phone. "What did she say?" Rebecca's voice softened, but only slightly. She said, "Proof can explain the past, but it cannot erase how it felt to stand alone in it." Ethan stood in the hospital hallway with Richard's letter in his hand and Claire's ring in his pocket, finally understanding that the truth had arrived exactly as Claire promised. But it had not saved him. It had judged him. Ethan did not find Claire through apology, money, or the Whitmore name. He found her because Richard remembered something everyone else had forgotten. 3 days after the surgery, while the hospital room was quiet and the afternoon light fell across the blanket, Richard opened his eyes and asked Ethan whether Claire still kept the silver compass on her keychain. Ethan nodded, though the memory came slowly. Claire's mother had given it to her when she was 16, and Claire used to say it reminded her that lost people were not always gone. They were sometimes just waiting to choose a direction. Richard breathed carefully before speaking again. "She once told me that if life ever became too loud, she would go north until she could hear herself think." "Maine," Ethan said. Richard closed his eyes. "Camden, maybe. She liked the harbor there." Ethan left for Maine the next morning in a rental car, because his own car felt too tied to the life that had failed her. He drove nearly 300 miles through gray winter roads, past gas stations, bare trees, small towns, and stretches of highway where the silence gave him too much room to remember. He remembered Claire at breakfast, asking him to trust her. Claire in the hospital hallway months earlier, holding a paper cup of coffee she had not had time to drink. Claire in the rain, not yelling, not begging, only giving him the truth in one sentence he had been too proud to receive. By the time he reached Camden, the air smelled like salt and cold wood smoke. The town was small, with brick storefronts, quiet streets, and boats rocking gently in the harbor. Ethan checked the hotel first, then the clinic near the water, then a small patient support center attached to a community health nonprofit. He found her there just before closing, standing behind a reception desk in a navy sweater, speaking gently to an older woman about transportation to a medical appointment 40 miles away. Claire looked thinner, not fragile, but sharpened by peace. Her hair was pinned back. Her wedding ring was gone. When she saw Ethan through the glass door, she did not look surprised. That was the first thing that hurt him. She had known he would come eventually, and she had already decided who she would be when he arrived. Claire finished helping the woman, handed her a printed schedule, and waited until the lobby emptied before stepping outside. The wind off the harbor moved around them. Ethan had practiced a dozen openings during the drive, but every one of them sounded useless now. He took the ring from his coat pocket and held it out, not as a demand, not even as a hope, but as proof of what he had carried. Claire looked at it, then back at him. "Did your father make it through?" she asked. Ethan swallowed. "Yes. The surgery went well. He is recovering." Her shoulders softened for half a second, and Ethan saw the relief she tried not to show. "Good," she said. "I am glad." He nodded, unable to hide how much her kindness wounded him. "Claire," I opened the folder. "I know everything. The cottage, the guarantee, Mercer, the messages, what my mother and Madison did, what you did for my father, for the company, for me." His voice broke, but he forced himself to keep going. "I was wrong. I was cruel. I should have believed you before proof made it easy." Claire looked toward the harbor, where the water moved in small silver lines beneath the cloudy sky. For a moment, Ethan thought she might finally cry, but she did not. That made it worse. "I used to imagine this moment," she said quietly. "Not because I wanted you to suffer. Because I wanted to know that the truth mattered." "It does," Ethan said. "It matters now." Claire turned back to him. "No, Ethan. It matters when it costs something to believe it. It matters before the folder, before the doctor, before the signatures. It matters when your wife stands in front of you with nothing but her word, and you decide whether her heart has earned your trust." Ethan had no defense. The harbor bell sounded in the distance, low and lonely. He looked down at the ring in his hand. "I came to ask for forgiveness," he said. "Not to demand anything. Not to ask you to come home today. I just needed to tell you that my father knows, and he wanted you to know that we know." Claire's face changed at Richard's name. For the first time, pain crossed it openly. He should not blame himself. "He tried to protect me." Ethan shook his head. "He blames all of us. Mostly me." Claire breathed in slowly. "Your father saw me when the rest of you looked through me. That is why I stayed as long as I did. Not because I was weak. Not because I had nowhere to go. Because I thought love meant staying until people learned how to love you back." Ethan stepped closer, but stopped when she did not move toward him. "And now?" he asked. Claire's voice was calm. "Now I think love should not require a person to disappear first." The words landed harder than anger would have. Ethan closed his fingers around the ring. "Claire, is there any chance, even someday, that I can make this right?" She looked at him for a long time, and in her eyes he saw the woman who had loved him, the woman he had failed, and the woman who had survived both. "I forgive you enough to stop carrying what you did," she said. "But I do not trust you enough to carry my heart again. Not now. Maybe not ever." Ethan nodded because he had finally learned that her answer was not a punishment. It was a boundary. Before she went back inside, Claire paused at the door. "Tell Richard the first, am grateful he made it. Tell him the world still needs men who learn the truth before it is too late." Ethan looked up. "And me?" Claire held his gaze, gentle but unreachable. "You learned it late, Ethan. What you do with that is no longer my responsibility." Then she stepped inside the support center, and the door closed softly between them, leaving Ethan on the sidewalk with the ring, the harbor wind, and the terrible mercy of not being hated by the woman he had lost. 6 months later, the Whitmore estate no longer looked untouched. Margaret had moved out after Richard changed the family trust and removed her influence from every major company decision. Madison was sent to work in a small nonprofit office funded by Whitmore Holdings, not as punishment alone, but because Richard said comfort had taught her nothing and service might teach her what privilege never could. Ethan stayed, but he was no longer the man who once mistook silence for loyalty and pride for strength. He rebuilt the company slowly, paid back every private guarantee Claire had made, and bought back her mother's cottage in Chatham without putting his name anywhere near it. The deed arrived at Claire's support center in Maine inside a plain envelope, along with a note that said only, "What was yours should never have been the price of saving us." Claire stood by the harbor when she read it. For a long time, she did not move. Then she folded the note, placed it in her coat pocket, and walked back inside to help a family waiting for hospital transport. A year after the night in the rain, Ethan received an invitation printed on thick cream paper. It was for the opening of the Claire Whitmore Patient Bridge Fund, a foundation created to help families trapped between illness, bills, and impossible choices. Richard was listed as honorary chair. Ethan was listed nowhere. Still, he went. He stood in the back of the room as Claire spoke beneath warm lights, calm, graceful, and whole without him. When her eyes found his, she gave one small nod. Not a promise, not a return, just peace. Ethan finally understood that forgiveness was not a door opening to the past. Sometimes it was simply the moment a person stopped standing outside it. And Claire, the woman they had thrown away, had become the one name their family would never again speak without gratitude.